now the wonderful Diane Lightfoot. Hello, Diane, and you're wearing purple.
Hello, Kate. Yes, especially for you. I've worn purple. I thought you would approve.
Good woman, taking us into the 3rd of December. Diane, thank you so much for your time today. So we've got 30 minutes with the incredible Diane Lightfoot. Diane's going to be focusing on how to foster a disability inclusive culture, both of course within office and remotely. So she's going to take us into the lunchtime period. We've got 30 precious minutes with you, Diane. So we'll leave you to manage that time as you see wish. People do like a few questions and comments at the end. So if you could build in a little bit of time, that would be lovely. So over to you.
Thank you very much, Kate. And yes, I have built in quite a bit of time at the end with any luck, if all goes to plan. And thank you for the glowing introduction, which I will fail to live up to, but I'll do my best. So if I can share my screen, I have called my presentation Culture Eats Strategy for Breakfast. And some of you will recognise that as a quote from Peter Drucker. I would love to say I'd come up with it myself, but consistently we see that building a culture is central to getting it right for disability inclusion for both employees and consumers, actually. But I'm mainly going to talk about employees. So my first slide, and this is a question which I think might be on Slido, is do you know how many disabled people are in your workforce? And Kieran can tell me if there's a Slido question.
Diane, if you could just get delegates to make a note of that in the chat, that would be good.
Yeah, okay. So if you can make a note in the chat about whether you have any, if you know how many disabled people are in your workforce. And the answer is almost certainly no. Although I did come a cropper this time last year when I gave a presentation to the Ministry of Justice, and I said, do you know how many disabled people are in your workforce? And somebody at the back of the room stood up and said yes, and reeled off the stats from the latest staff survey. So that put me in my place. But the reason I say that you almost certainly don't is that over 90% of disabilities are not immediately visible. So you almost certainly are already employing, working alongside, and indeed know in your personal life, many more disabled people than you think you do. And this is borne out by a piece of research. It's a few years ago now, but it makes this point really quite starkly from one of our ambassadors, Helen Cook. 76% of disabled graduates were worried about telling an employer about their disability. And only 56%, so quite a gap, felt that there might be benefits to telling their prospective employer about their disability. And I'm not going to get into a lot about how to decide as an individual whether to or how to tell your employer about your disability, mainly because Kate quite literally wrote the book on that with secrets and big news. But I'm going to focus on what it matters, how it matters to an employer and what you can do as an employer to get people to tell you. So you might be thinking, why does it matter anyway? If over 90% of disabled people have a condition which is not immediately visible and you don't know about it, do you actually need to? And you might not, but the question really is, where is people's energy going? And we hear loads of stories at Business Disability Forum, so through our advice service, of people who are struggling to find somewhere private to take a lot of medication, or who are worrying about the amount of hospital appointments they need to go to, or are trying to manage pain or fatigue. And all those things mean that somebody is going to be thinking about those things rather than focusing on doing the best possible job for you, which sounds quite obvious, really. And one of the things that another of our ambassadors talks about as well is that employers tend to view mental health particularly as an issue, and they really worry about employing people with mental health conditions because, generally speaking, they have no idea that someone has a mental health condition until At best, perhaps they're not coping very well, or at worst, they're in crisis. Whereas actually having a conversation up front, which is, I have depression, or I have anxiety, or I have whatever condition, and this is how you can support me. And this is what you might notice if I'm becoming unwell. And this is what I need you to do at that point, can make a huge, huge difference in building understanding, and also prevent people having to communicate some really quite difficult stuff when they're not in a good place. And again, I think this is a Kate expression, enabling people to bring their whole selves to work. It means that they're going to be more productive for you. There's a very important point here around identity, which I will come back to a little bit again later. There are lots of people who qualify, if you like, I do air quotes here, as being disabled under the Equality Act, may not identify with the word disabled. So I've just talked about mental health. Lots of people with mental health conditions would not consider themselves to be disabled. Lots of people with long-term health conditions might not particularly identify with that word, but they might still need adjustments. So you still need to know or find a way to give them the adjustments they need. And I will say a bit more about that too. And this is also especially important with the lens of COVID-19. We're all living and working very differently now. And some of the adjustments that people needed in the workplace will not have gone away, but some of them will be new. And being able to spot the signs as a manager when working remotely adds an extra challenge and layer on there. Also talking about people bringing their whole selves to work, I mentioned our advice service, and we get lots of calls from managers who are saying that maybe they're about to start a performance management process with a member of staff whose report writing isn't to the right level of accuracy, or is not producing reports or written materials on time. And it turns out that actually that person has dyslexia, maybe undiagnosed dyslexia, or something they haven't felt able to share with their employer. And that can mean the difference between someone actually doing a really good job or not. And often simple adjustments then put in place mean that someone can do a great job for you. I always think that those people that come through to the advice service, those managers, that their employees are the lucky ones. And I wonder how many people slip through the net, undergo a performance process, or maybe even lose their job because their manager hasn't had the insight just to take a step back and think, is something else going on? So I was asked to think about reframing disability. And I think the really key thing here in the context of employment is reframing disability as talent. Why on earth would you want to exclude a quite significant talent pool? And you may remember, I'm sorry to remind you of this, before we had COVID, we had Brexit. I kind of think that having COVID should let us off Brexit, but that takes me very much off topic, so I won't go there. But even before Brexit, many sectors were talking about serious skills shortages. I remember being on a platform, an actual platform rather than a virtual one, with our member Balfour Beatty for Construction Week a couple of years ago. And I was citing a skills survey, the employee skills survey, I think from the year before, the 2017 one, that had said that about half of managers in construction were really worried about skills shortages. And my friend from Balfour Beatty next to me said, well, the other 50% are deluding themselves. So there's a real issue there around talent and not excluding the people who may be the very, very best people for your job. And culture is really key here. So I've put for attraction, does recruitment imagery, does the stories you use, do they reflect someone like me? Any candidate all the way through the application process, to any screening, to interview, to meeting with the wider team, is going to pick up on, or certainly will be looking out for, what the culture is like. And is this a culture that is going to be supportive? Is this a culture that will meet my needs, will enable me to be at my best, be at my most productive, and be able to develop, thrive, and flourish within this organization? So that's really, really critical. And I know the brief here is not particularly to talk about consumers, but also thinking around the power of the purple pound and also linking that back to brand. So in the UK, it's estimated that the spending power of disabled people and their families is £249 billion a year. And the Valuable 500 also quotes the fact that globally, this is a market the size of China. So why on earth would you want to exclude that market? Another of our ambassadors, Phil Friend, tweeted last summer, it would have been, when we were able to go away on holiday. He said he was going to Centre Parks because they're really accessible. And he said, and as a result of that, it wasn't just him that was going, it was a 16-strong party of all his family who were all going because it was accessible, and he's a wheelchair user. And, you know, the message that sends out around how important that is, but also the fact that this is about the bottom line of your business as well, I think is really, really important. It's not about doing people favours. And again, when you then link that back into the employee piece, actually having a workforce that represents the society that you serve and represents the people that you want to actually buy your product has got to be a good thing. A lot of people, and I'm sure that I'm preaching to the converted here, because the fact that you're on this conference today means I hope that you believe this and you get it. But so many people worry that it's too difficult or too expensive, or they might voice that, or they might be thinking that in the background, but it really isn't, and it really doesn't have to be. Many adjustments, as I'm sure you'll be aware, that are needed or to be made for disabled colleagues are free. I mean, before COVID, working from home was the most frequently requested workplace adjustment. Many others are very, very cheap, and access to work can also help. So I've talked about attraction and recruitment, but it's also about retention. So when I speak to people about disability, the preconceptions are generally that it's about a physical disability and that it's present from birth. The figures are very different. So 83% of disabilities are acquired. So it is very much about retaining people in your workforce. And if you've invested in members of staff and they have organizational memory and knowledge and skills, you want to keep that. And one of our partners, Atos, did a piece of research that showed that it was something like 40% more expensive, at least that, to replace somebody because you've lost them for whatever reason, than it is to make an adjustment to keep them in post. So making it clear that adjustments are available and making it clear how you get them and what they are. So lots of people who have acquired a disability may not know what is available, may never have had to think about themselves as disabled, have even know the term adjustments, but being able to promote the kind of things that you can do around working differently that someone might be able to take advantage of is really, really important. I've put here that the line manager relationship is crucial, and I should also say a little plug that we launched our own People Manager Toolkit this very morning, sponsored by our friends at Microlink, who I think are also sponsoring today. But the reason we've created that is because people managers are the ones that make it happen. So you can have a fabulous HR team, you can have a fabulous D&I team, you can have brilliant policies and processes. But if an employee doesn't have the confidence to have a conversation with their line manager about what they need, and if the line manager doesn't have the confidence to then respond to that need, it all falls down. So really, it's about that support to have the conversation. And I talked earlier about performance management and an example of someone who had dyslexia and hadn't told their manager for whatever reason. We also frequently get calls through to our advice service around a manager saying, I've got an employee who isn't paying attention in meetings. And when they actually talk to them, it turns out that they're losing their hearing and they're going to great pains to conceal that. But obviously it means that they're not able to be as productive as they were. And once that's known and adjustments can be put in place, then the whole problem goes away. Now, lots of people, of course, will find it very difficult to ask for adjustments. So some really nice and positive things that we're seeing in this space is reframing the language of adjustments. And I was on another roundtable earlier this morning where we were talking about language and how language that is inherently neutral, like adjustments, actually has become associated with sort of special treatment. So some organizations are now saying, well, let's reframe this as productivity tools. So what do you need to be able to do your job well? You don't have to have dyslexia to use Dragon speech to text software. You might just be someone who is not often with access to a computer, and you might want to be able to dictate straight onto the screen. I was at a customer task force a couple of years ago, and Barclays, who's one of our partners, were talking about the fact they'd introduced self-service adjustments up to a certain spend level. And you could see everyone looking around the room at each other, and you could see that the unspoken question was, well, aren't you worried that that's going to be abused? And I said, actually, unless you're going to buy all your family speech to text software or a sit-stand desk for Christmas, why on earth would it be? So it is about this whole thing about trust and trusting disabled people to know what they need and to be the experts as well. I also saw a really nice example recently of an organisation who had moved their assistive technology to sit in the same place on their intranet as standard software, so say Microsoft Suite, which meant that someone who wanted to download or get access to something assistive could do it in the same place and didn't have to make a separate request. And those sorts of things make such a difference in kind of normalising the conversation and making it safe for people to ask what they need. I've highlighted here redeployment as a reasonable adjustment, because we also see when we do research and surveys amongst our members and partners that there is a lack of awareness that redeployment is legally an adjustment under the Equality Act. So if someone acquires a disability and for whatever reason they can't do the job or the whole job that they were doing for you before, it is perfectly legal to transfer them to a different job. I had a really nice but very close to home literally example of that earlier this year, and I had some building work done during lockdown, which was well, just after lockdown, which was slightly challenging. But our project manager said to me, I want to get cracking with the bathroom, because we've got one of the team coming back who's got a bad back and just had a hernia operation. So I don't want him doing the building work. I want him to do the tiling. And I thought, that, my friend, is redeployment as a reasonable adjustment. I didn't say that to him, or he probably would have thought I'd gone a bit mad. But it's actually as simple as that. It's actually about adapting a job to what somebody is able to do at this point in time. That, of course, links to a great back to work process. So a really open conversation, which might be quite difficult if someone has got a new diagnosis or acquired a disability, but actually just really exploring what somebody needs, what an adjustment might look like, and how to return, whether it's on a phased basis or with a reduction in duties over a period, is really, really important. And again, taking you back to that point around retention. I also wanted to say a word around sick pay. So we quite often get consultations and questions around enhanced sick pay. And enhanced sick pay is definitely a good thing, but not at the detriment of engaging with your member of staff who is off, who may feel very isolated and very uncertain and very frightened, particularly if this is a sort of life-changing event that has happened to them. So really supporting them through that process is absolutely key. And the point I've got at the end of this slide is around development. So again, pretty consistently we see that disabled people do not progress in their careers at the same pace or to the same level as their non-disabled peers. And so making sure that career development programs that you run in your organisation, firstly, are accessible in and of themselves is really important. And you also might want to consider running dedicated programs for disabled employees. Some of our members and partners have done that, and we ran a couple of open courses last year. And they have been really positive, particularly for people, again, who've acquired a disability. And typically, the trainer tells me that they feel about ready after about, say, 18 months to then explore a new identity in both a sort of personal and professional capacity, and then think about what might be limiting them in progressing in their careers. And that's had some really great feedback from across a really broad spectrum of disability. And the piece around identity, when I was having breakfast this morning listening to Six Music, as I often do because I find Radio 4 just too blooming depressing these days, and they happened to have a guest on who was talking about rowing, but he talked about the fact that he'd lost both his legs in an accident, and he said that he lost his identity, but then he regained it, and he thought, actually, I'm still the same person. There's just a bit less of me, but having that support through that process is really, really important. I want to say a quick thing about senior managers. So obviously what senior leaders say has a disproportionate impact, and they have a huge role in setting the tone and in what matters around here. And I know that senior leaders worry about saying exactly the right thing, but having the right intention and just talking about disability and normalizing the conversation is just so, so important. I've talked about people manager confidence, and that stems very much from the senior leaders as well. And just having the confidence not to be an expert in disability, but just to be able to say, what do you need? Are you okay? Are you really okay? And to take a step back and think, is there something else going on before I react in the way that I might do as a knee jerk? Is there something going on? I've put supporting the wider team, which I think is really, really important in the context of adjustments, in disabilities that are not visible. So when there is misunderstanding around why someone has a dedicated desk, if there's a hot desk policy, or a parking space, or is using the accessible toilet, actually working with that individual to agree with them what they're happy to share with the wider team can go a long way to preventing misunderstanding. I also heard a story about a recent graduate who had autism, and he was doing a great job in a technical firm, but the rest of the team was saying he didn't fit. And on closer questioning, it turned out that the other members of the team were saying to this guy, what do you think about this piece of work I've done? And he was telling them, and sometimes quite bluntly. And so we said, well, look, if we can work with this guy, and if he's happy to explain how he communicates, and how if they want a different answer, they need to ask a different question, then that could go a huge way in him being supported. And all these conversations have to be underpinned with practical action. And as an example of the importance of senior leadership, I put inclusion as a choice at the end. So we had our annual conference last month, and we were talking about the fact that in the briefings from 10 Downing Street from COVID, there is never a BSL interpreter. By contrast, Nicola Sturgeon always has one. And apparently, when this was brought to their attention, the response back from number 10 was that the room wasn't big enough. And as one of our panelists said, well, I'm sure they have access to other rooms. And the message that sends out around what's important is so incredibly powerful. In this instance, not in a good way, but it can be in a good way. My final couple of slides, a note on language. I really, really hate the terms disclose and declare. They are inherently negative. As you might be able to see from that screen, it's a picture of an airport with customs inquiries and goods to declare. It is inherently a negative thing, something to be ashamed of, something you shouldn't have done, something that you might not want to be found out. If you actually just reframe that as tell us what you need or share your story, it is so much more positive and so much more empowering. If you want to tell you as well, when and how you ask people is key. We did some work with the civil service, and when they asked the question, are you disabled? This one department, they found 6% of people tick the box. When they changed the question to, do you consider yourself to have a disability or long-term condition, such as diabetes, depression, asthma, MS, that went up 10 percentage points to 16%. So language really, really is key. And also think about your wider organisational messaging. If you've got a campaign running around asking people to tell you about adjustments, or say around mental health, and it's sitting alongside posters advertising an Ironman competition, or showing who's got the sort of the best financial results this quarter, it's probably going to undermine it. Last thing really, with the lens of COVID, we're all working very differently now. So being able to spot the signs remotely is really, really important. And remembering that people will still need adjustments. They might be different, but they will still need them. Remember privilege. So I don't have a home office, but I'm lucky enough to have a space and a decent Wi-Fi. Not everyone has that. And giving people permission to work flexibly in a way that suits them, to take breaks, to do exercise in the middle of the day and take a longer lunch break now that the days are so much shorter in terms of daylight, can make a real difference in giving people permission to actually work in a way that suits them, rather than feeling they have to be glued to their laptop from 9 till 5. I'm going to say a bit more about this later on, but also not confusing disability and vulnerability around COVID. So a disabled person may be no more vulnerable to COVID. Equally, someone with asthma or a respiratory condition may be extremely vulnerable. So really think individually about people. And also hang on to what works. And I will say more about this in the session this afternoon. I do think there's a possibility of positive legacy and a way for people to engage in different ways, whether it's using a chat function in Zoom rather than having to stand up in front of a whole room. So let's hold on to some of that in terms of cultural change as well. So that's it. And I hope there are still a couple of minutes for some questions.
There are indeed, Diane. That's fantastic, and as ever, covered a lot of ground in that presentation. So thank you. So I've been looking in the chat box and the comments, and observations more than questions. So maybe just expand on a couple of things you mentioned, Diane. So a couple of comments then saying, it's often really hard for those on the front line. So, it's absolutely proper to think about disability inclusion from the top down and getting senior business leaders engaged and excited. But it's often the line managers who are on the front line who don't always get the support that they need to give them the confidence to have those conversations which allow disabled people to have rich and impactful and purposeful conversations about security. I mean, any extra thoughts on that, Diane? What can...
Well, obviously I plug my People Manager Toolkit, but I would absolutely agree with that. And in lots of these cases, the theory is pretty straightforward, but actually embedding it culturally so that every single manager thinks, yes, I can talk about disability, and it is a core part of my role, and it isn't a separate managing hat I put on. It's just about getting the best out of every employee. And I just think there need to be more conversations around that, and it doesn't have to be difficult. I would love to tell you there was a magic answer. I don't think there is, but it is vital. Yeah.
And it's more of the same. It's never one done, is it, Diane? I mean, occasionally we might come across organisations that hope that one particular initiative or project or what have you is going to resolve this, but it's often about repeat, isn't it?
It's absolutely about repeat. And it's about having it a standard and kind of baked into everything. So making sure that when you design a new process or a policy, that before you get it out there, you think, actually, does this work for my disabled colleagues? And not just disabled colleagues, does it work for everyone? It's about things like procurement. And we were talking earlier about adjustments, and you can have great adjustments in place, but then the IT's updated it and all the assistive technology crashes. And then someone has to go through asking again. And all those things send out a message about, well, actually, they haven't thought about me and I don't really matter. So it's just keeping saying, what about disability? What about disability? Involving people, user testing, just baking it in, really.
Yeah, lovely. And then a private one came to me. How hopeful do you feel about the world being able to learn the good lessons from COVID? It has been extraordinary time, we know that, and lots of people have not fared well over this period, Diane, but as you look across your membership and to employers generally, what do you hope that they will hang on to in terms of agile practices and working remotely?
Well, funny you should say that, Kate, because I am doing the keynote this afternoon on that very topic. But actually quite optimistic. So at the beginning of the pandemic, I was really worried that businesses would say, actually, you know what, we've got too much going on, disability inclusion, not now, we'll come back to it. The opposite has been the case. Yeah. And we've had more inquiries, more interest, more engagement. And I think it's really made people think about the human condition and about well-being and looking after each other, and also making them realise that some of those preconceptions about people having to be in the office 9 to 5 every day, they really don't matter. That's not true for every industry, of course, and some service industries, but for lots of jobs, they can be done differently and can be done remotely. And I know that disabled people have done disproportionately badly in previous recessions, so I'm not going to be all Pollyanna about it and glib about it. But actually, given that how we're working now, why does that have to be the case this time? I think we've all got a role in making sure that it isn't, and having a blended economy of work. And if the vaccine, please let the vaccine work, because I really do miss seeing people, I have to say. But let's not all just say, "Oh, great, let's go back to the office and go back to exactly how we were." Let's say, well, let's have a mix. It's good for everybody, and it really equalizes the experience in lots of ways, not completely, but in lots of ways.
Yeah, brilliant. A hopeful message.
Yeah.
Wonderful. Diane, that's fantastic. So for the time being, huge thanks, lots of engagement. People really enjoying this. So thank you so much for your time.
Thank you.